Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us. If you've joined us before, welcome back. If this is your first time joining us for Vo's Hidden Collections, you are in for a treat for sure. As we are joined once again by my dear colleague, our dear colleague, Bo Van Riper, who's going to be taking us on another journey into the collections to share with us the hidden histories and untold stories and surprising finds within the museum's archives that tell the story of our island. Before we begin, I would like to mention another program series that the museum is offering right now. Modeled after our exhibition One Island, Many Stories, the monthly series explores the exhibit's 7 themes through conversations with members of our island community about the past, the present, and the future of our island. So next Thursday, the 15th at 4 p.m., we will feature Liz Durkee, who is the Commission's climate change planner. She's going to be in conversation with Bo about the theme of changing. So it's going to be a fascinating discussion, and you can learn more and register on our website. So I hope you can join us for that. We do love being able to offer programming, especially free programs like this one today. And we rely on your support to keep these programs going. So if you haven't already, maybe consider a membership to the museum. We've got a lot of wonderful things in store for the future, and we can't do it without your help. So any support is very much appreciated. So before I turn it over to Bo today, I just wanted to remind you all that feel free to post questions in the question and answer or the chat box anytime during the program, and I will field them to Bo when he is done. We'll make sure to save a couple minutes at the end for him to answer questions. So without further ado, let me pass it over to Bo. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And as always, thank you all for being part of this. And welcome to another tour through the dim, distant corners of the archives. And let me start today with this extremely mundane looking shot of a dock somewhere in Edgartown. You're looking across the channel towards the ferry landing on Chappaquiddick. And the thing I want to call your attention to is not the dock, not the boats, not the buildings in the background, but those gallows-like structures that rise along the right side of the dock, which exist if you look up in the upper right-hand corner of the photograph, to carry wires and insulators and sockets and electric light bulbs. When this picture was taken on the Edgartown waterfront, sometime in probably 1938 or 1939, based on the context, somebody at least had taken the trouble to wire their dock for electric lights so that when they got off the boat at the end of a long day when the sun was setting, they could see where they were going. Now, in and of itself, this is a pretty trivial observation, and yet it's a piece of a bigger puzzle. We know roughly when each of the vineyard towns were electrified. We know that famously Gayhead was not electrified until 1951, the last town in the Commonwealth to get electrical service, and that electricity was what made it possible to decommission the kerosene lamp and thus the Fresnel lens and the Gayhead light, which of course is now on display in the Linneman Pavilion here at the museum. But what we don't know about the history of electrification on the Vineyard is how electricity as a technology and as a fact of life penetrated into people's everyday lives on a more fine textured scale. We know, because he wrote about it in Country Editor in 1940, that Henry Beadle Huff, when he was running the Gazette in the 1920s, installed a linotype machine, which cast, as the brand name suggests, lines of type from molten metal. and thus required an electrical power source for the heating elements that kept the pot of molten metal well molten and usable. And he tells a very funny story in Country Editor about negotiating with the power company, which, for whatever complicated reason, didn't want to go to the trouble of hooking up power to the Gazette office and keeping electricity flowing even during the evening and even during the off season. That's a data point, the existence of electric lights, not just in somebody's home, but strung, admittedly, probably in a very ad hoc way down somebody's dock in Edgartown is another. And out of a dozen, 100, 1,000 little data points like this, we gradually, over a very long time, build up a picture of how electricity came to the vineyard and how, over the course of the 20th century, lights lit by candles and oil lamps and kerosene lamps gradually gave way to evenings lit by electric bulbs. Next slide, please. Speaking of evenings lit by electric bulbs, this is a view of Edgartown Harbor at twilight. You can see the lights on the boats in the harbor. You can see the lights on the far shore at Chappaquiddick, and midway along the far right side of the picture, if like me, you've got my talking head obscuring it, just click the single horizontal line at the top and it'll collapse that part of the screen. On the right there's a big dark blob with a lit up band at the top. And if you don't recognize it yet, maybe you will now. Next slide, please. Because here's a more fanciful depiction of it. The old pre-1939 Edgartown Harbor Light, built in 1834, an actual two-story wooden house with the lighthouse lantern on the crest of the roof at the end of a long wooden causeway reaching out from the North Water Street shore. That preceding picture, if we can go back one for just a second, is, as far as I know, the only extant picture of the old Edgartown Harbor Light sometime in the mid-1930s actually lit up and shining out over the harbor. Okay, forward two, please. Here's another picture from the same era, from the same photographer. You're standing by way of orientation on what would now be called the fill dock or the drive-on dock at Menemsha, looking out past the breakwaters into Vineyard Sound with Cuttyhunk in the distance. You can see the beacon tower on the right side of the entrance, and you can see a dragger working its way into or out of the harbor. And you can see in the foreground that there is no drive-on dock, no fill dock yet, that the land separating the channel on the left from the boat basin on the right is still just a sand spit. And next slide, if you turn slightly to your right, you can see again the breakwater separating the Menemsha boat basin and beach from Vineyard Sound in the distance. And you can see the bulkhead dock where Pools and Larson's fish markets are now, and where the Menemsha gas station is nowadays, behind where these boats are in this picture. And you look and you realize that behind all those masts of sword fishing boats and draggers and whatnot, there is no dock projecting out perpendicular to the bulkhead. There is no dock where yachts tie up and small dinghies tie up that runs parallel to the inside surface of the breakwater. Dutcher Dock, as it's known, doesn't exist yet, because when this picture was taken, Rodney Dutcher, Washington journalist, yachtsman, one-time summer resident of Menemsha, was not yet the savior of the port of Menemsha, who raised enormous amounts of money among his Washington cronies after the hurricane of 38 wiped Menemsha off the map. Next slide. You look at the back of the picture and you realize that this is Menemsha in that last perfect moment before September 21st, 1938, before the Great New England Hurricane, as it became known, came roaring up the Atlantic coast without warning, made landfall in Long Island and Connecticut, and clipped the western end of Martha's Vineyard with its northeast quadrant, driving a storm surge over Stonewall Beach, through Squidnocket Pond and Quitsa Pond, and through Menemsha Pond and up the channel, washing away everything in its path, boats and fishing shacks and docks and livelihoods and everything else. There's a picture taken at Pearl Harbor just before the bombs began to fall. Walter Lord used it in his book, Day of Infamy, captioned the last moment of peace. And those photographs of Menemsha, taken in the summer of 1938, are, in the same sense, images of a world about to be irrevocably swept away. Next slide, please. Here's the young man responsible for those images, for the shot of the light bulbs on the dock at Edgartown, for the shot of the old Edgartown light damaged in the 38 hurricane, but already rodent and termite ridden and scheduled to be torn down, who took at least one of the photographs of Menemsha before the hurricane. His name was Charles Mason James, and he was the son of a food store magnate, William F. James, from Philadelphia. He vacationed with his mother and father at the Harborview Hotel in the 1930s and the early 1940s. And it was Charles who, when he wasn't shooting still pictures with a wide format camera like the one he's shown with here, was also shooting in the summer of 1940 and the summer of 1941 motion picture film, 16 millimeter motion picture film of his family's vacation. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the James family vacation film that we posted on our website with my voiceover commentary, but if you've ever wondered who was the filmmaker behind it, well, this is him on the dock at Menemsha with his camera, shot presumably by one of his parents with their camera. It's a truism in virtually every American family where the same member of the family is usually the designated photographer. That's the person who you'd never think was part of the family because they don't show up in the pictures. So too, thanks to the James families passing on folders and folders of pictures that Charles took in the 1930s and early 1940s on the Vineyard, thanks to them passing on the motion picture film, which we were able to have digitized. We have this incredible, not just window on the Vineyards as it was in the late 30s and the early 40s on the eve of World War II, but one particular person's vision of the Vineyard in that era. Because as you flip through the photographs like the ones we were just looking at, as you look through the film, you realize that Charles James, in his teens and 20s when he shot this stuff, was not just taking vacation snapshots. He had an artistic eye. He had a sense of what he wanted to capture. That shot of the lighthouse lit up is objectively a terrible record of what Edgartown Harbor looked like at that moment, because he's shooting in low light with film that's not really technically capable of capturing what he wants to capture, and there's fog in the air, and the light sources are all smeared out into blurs, and the outlines of the boats and the land and the lighthouse are indistinct. And yet, in that photograph, there is a sort of odd, abstract impressionist beauty to it that a clearer, crisper, sharper postcard-like image would completely fail to capture. So too, why would you shoot a random picture of a random dock in Edgartown? Well, maybe I'm imposing my own predilections about the stuff I'm interested in history, but I suspect he was walking down the Edgartown waterfront and thought, electric lights on a dock. I've never seen that before. And set up the picture to emphasize that line of electrical cord running straight down the center line of the picture as it runs straight down the center line of the dock, reaching out into the distance. To get some idea, next slide, of just how much Charles James thought about his work, you really have to flip through this notebook that he kept while he was making the 16mm film that we put up on the website. Next slide, please. In the pages of this notebook, James storyboards the entire film. Those pictures down the sides are a shot-by-shot record sketched by Charles of what each shot in the film looks like. And you'll notice it captures not just, look forward down there to the picture of the Federated Church spire. It captures not just what's in the frame, but it captures the camera angle. If the shot on the film is the camera looking up from street level at the vertiginously tall Federated Church spire, the picture captures that. Next slide. And in the notes down the other side of the page, James is describing what he's doing with the camera, why he's doing it, how he sees the shots fitting together. Next slide. He's talking, notice in these three pictures, there's an arrow in each case indicating how the boat is moving through the frame. And in the write-ups to the right of each shot, he's explaining why he made the choices he did about composition and what the significance of the boat moving the way it's moving is. He's also talking about why he put the shots together, next slide, in the order that he put them together. The number 55 shot here is a picture of a garden with, as he says, an old rib from a ship made up to simulate a davit, that sort of curvy thing with the dangly bit on the end. And he notes that the davit is set up in the midst of a formal flower garden, which comes at the end of a series of shots of other flower gardens. And just before shot 56 there, the beginning of a series of shots of the waterfront and boats moving past buildings. So he says in the commentary, the davit is meant to suggest a maritime element and to serve as a kind of visual cue to the fact that we're about to move away from flower gardens and into a section of the film's coverage of Edgartown that's not about the flowers in people's backyards, but about the harbor along the edges of Dock and Water Street. Next slide, please. And you read through an entire notebook of this stuff, and on the one hand, you're going, yeah, kid, go to film school, be the next Spielberg or the next Lucas, or, well, okay, it was 1940, so be the next Preston Sturges or the next Howard Hawks. And it's like, man, you are really going all in on the seriousness and on the I am a serious filmmaker thing. And yet, think about your vacation videos. Think about the vacation videos of everybody you've ever watched, of everybody whose vacation videos you've ever watched. And it's the same agglomeration of people grinning at the camera and waving and jumping up and down and making exaggerated gestures as if the camera person was saying, move, move, it's a motion picture for goodness sake. And the shots go on and on and on with no particular order other than that they happened in the order that they happened and were recorded. And you think about that, and then you look at Charles James's depiction of his family's vacation in 1940 and 41, and you realize that you are looking in James's film at a work of art created by somebody who sat down and thought before he's picked up the camera, and thought as he was shooting, and thought later as he was cutting the bits of film together about the story he wanted to tell and how he wanted to use the juxtaposition of images to tell it. Alfred Eisenstadt used to talk about how he would take hours to set up his camera in a particular place on the vineyard and then wait for the clouds and the light to be exactly where he wanted, creating exactly the effect he wanted before he squeezed the shutter and took the picture. It could be argued that that's the kind of preparation, the kind of thought, the kind of deliberateness that separates art, or what an artist does with a camera, still or motion picture, from what the rest of us do with a movie camera or a video camera, or nowadays our phones. And looking at James's film, looking at his notebook, you realize just how much he was doing that in his early 20s on vacation on the vineyard. And it makes you wonder, whatever happened to him? And since Hollywood never heard of him, what was it that he got diverted into that kept him from pursuing this talent that he obviously had in such enormous abundance? Next slide. Maybe you've seen this tower. It's the Gay Head Light. If you look up there in the lantern, you'll notice that this is a pre-1951 image, because that giant white beehive shaped thing is the Fresnel lens under the white cotton cover that was put over it during the day to keep the rays of the sun from being focused on it by the prisms and overheating the equipment inside the lens. That's the old wooden keeper's house beside it, built in 1901 and torn down after the light was automated, probably sometime in the very late 50s or very early 60s. All of that's fairly familiar. There are a million pictures and 1,000 postcards of the Gay Head Light and of the wooden keeper's house. But look a little closer. Next slide, please. On the left there is, what is it? Some kind of a tower with what appears to be a ladder going up the side of it, a platform at the top. The two angled lines are probably guy wires to hold it rigid, and some kind of a mast. But for what purpose? The life-saving station further along the cliffs at Gay Head had its own lookout tower, so it's not that. Is the platform on top of the tower the point? And if somebody was supposed to stand up there and look for something, why wouldn't you just use the lighthouse, which is much taller and offers a better vantage point? Or maybe the mast on top of the platform is the point. Maybe it's a mast to raise storm signals on. And the point of the platform is to give the guy putting the flags up a place to stand while he's doing it. But if that's the case, why not just build a flagpole and have the poor sod stand on the ground? This is literally the only image I have ever seen that has a structure looking like that in it. So to my ever-growing to-do list is now added, see if I can figure out what the heck that was, when it was put up, and also when it was taken down, because it certainly didn't exist on the site by the early 1960s. Also, on the right side there looks to be, and again, something I've never seen in any other picture, a paved walkway or crushed shell or gravel, perhaps. It's just light colored. The texture may not be entirely apparent, extending outward from the steps of the house and going nowhere. Is that artistic license, or was there once a walkway to nowhere extending out from the keeper's house? Or was it once a walkway to somewhere, a walkway to an outbuilding that, for whatever reason, was moved or torn down, leaving a vestigial sidewalk to mark its presence, the way that the foundations of old radio towers out in the middle of the disc golf course in the state forest mark a time when there were structures there in the woods. Next slide. You can learn a lot from studying postcards, and it's not always the images. This particular picture of ox carts at Gay Head is labeled Gay Head Coaches. One of the services that local Wampanoag residents provided in the late 19th century and the early 20th century to day tourists who came by the excursion steamers that came in at Pilot's Landing at the foot of the cliffs was ox cart rides. You could walk from the landing up to the top of the cliffs where the lighthouse was if you wanted, but for a reasonable fee of 10 or 15 cents, Aaron Cooper or one of his fellow Gayhead farmers would be happy to give you a ride up in a two-wheeled cart pulled by their teams of oxen. It was like visiting the cliffs and cutting a piece of clay back in those days before it was a National Historic Landmark, like visiting the lighthouse and chatting with the keeper, like seeing the world from the balcony of the lighthouse or the lantern room. Part of the experience, a chance to immerse yourself in an exotic, primitive, distant from civilization corner of the island. Remember, the road to Gay Head wasn't paved until the 1920s, and so getting there required either a significant investment of time and effort, or for these tourists, a ticket on a steamer. So Gay Head Coaches, obviously this is the postcard maker having a little fun at the expense of the people at Gay Head. When this was printed, coaches were something that city dwellers, the kind who'd vacation on the Vineyard and maybe buy a day ticket to Gay Head, would have had in their everyday lives. If you were Dr. Daniel Fisher or his children, if you were one of the well-to-do citizens of Tisbury, like William Barry Owen, the gramophone magnate, you'd have a carriage house connected to your home, and you'd have a fine four-wheeled carriage and a couple of horses to pull it. To say that these rough and ready farm wagons or Gay Head coaches is to have a little bit of fun at the expense of those rubes who live on the farms at the far end of the island. And yet, it was also an acknowledgement that the rustic life that people were living at Gay Head in the 1880s, 90s, 1910s was fascinating to the summer tourists who came from a more industrialized, urbanized world. And there is not just gentle poking of fun here, but also an awareness that people came to Gay Head on their summer visits to the Vineyard in order to see a world, and they would have envisioned the Wampanoag as part of that world that was, they believed, even then fading into history. Next slide. Another picture of the Gay Headlight, this one prior to 1900, because it's still got the old brick keeper's house filled with damp air and toxic mold and prone to causing sickness and death among people who live there. But I'm showing you this postcard to call attention to that little logo up in the upper left-hand corner. It's a woman holding a probably 47 or 48 star, thank you, American flag with an eagle with its wings outstretched looking over her. She's doubtless a symbolic representation of the United States. But look at the scroll. Greetings from picturesque America. This is not something you see printed on Vineyard postcards, and it raises the question, what's that meant to connote? I mean, was this like the postcard that somebody decided to print from the foreign market? If you're sending a card back to your relatives in Tokyo or Marseille or Dakar or whatever, maybe you picked this one to say, hey, I'm in America on vacation, thought you'd like a postcard. Or is it trying to suggest something else? For that matter, was this a standardized graphic element that the company printing these postcards slapped on postcards of the Brooklyn Bridge or the giant sequoias or the Chicago stockyards, just as it did on a picture of the Gay Head Lighthouse? Till we find some more of them, if we find some more of them, we'll never know. But it's details like these that make you look at the nth picture postcard of Gay Head and go, okay, what were they going for there? What were they thinking of? What was running through their mind when they printed that? Next slide, please. We're back after 1900 again. There's the lighthouse on the left and the 1901 keeper's house, and a gigantic two-story building with an annex and a couple of chimneys, and what would, if this was the automobile age, which it's not yet, look suspiciously like a parking lot. Now, if you've driven along the road to the Gay Head Lighthouse any time in the last 50 or 60 years, it will strike you that that big building in the right foreground is no longer there. Next slide. And if you spent any time at the Gay Head Light in the last, again, 50 or 60 years ago, you'll note that the red building with the lines of first floor windows and the white dormers in the second floor roof isn't there either. Next slide. And you'll look at this photograph taken probably in, but judging by the car in the left foreground, maybe the mid 1920s, late 1920s. And you realize that the two-story building with the chimneys in the center right there, and the building with the dormers and the lined up windows, and the outbuilding to the right of the building with the dormers, I mean, good grief, it was downright crowded on the top of the Gay Head cliffs in the 1920s. The caption on this postcard, you'll note, helpfully identifies something as the Nottoway House, which was an inn run at Gay Head for a time in the early 20th century. What it doesn't tell you is which one of those was the Nottoway House. Somebody, probably not me, knows that. What was the other one? And when were they torn down? And what were they used for? What was the one that wasn't the Nottoway House? And what's the outbuilding with a window in each end? William Waterway, in his book on the Gay Head Light, talks about the structures around the Gay Head Light over the years and does a pretty good job of cataloging them. But you'd be astonished that for all the pictures of the Gay Head Light we have and for all the information we have about it, we know virtually nothing about the Nottoway Inn or any of the other commercial and practical structures that once surrounded the Gay Headlight and that made that area at the top of the cliffs once seem so crowded, when it now, if you stand at the base of the recently moved light, seems comparatively so empty. We know a great deal about the history of Gay Head. We know a great deal about the history of the Lighthouse. But all it takes is postcards like these last few to recognize just how much we don't yet know about this landscape around the lighthouse at the top of the cliffs as it once existed less than 100 years ago. Next slide. Lectures to Women on Anatomy and Physiology by Mary Gove, 1846. You can just imagine all the pre-teenage boys in the 1840s and 50s who pulled that off the shelf full of hope that forbidden knowledge lay within, only to be disappointed that it has 3 entire chapters devoted to the importance of chewing your food thoroughly and long learned discourses on the central nervous system. But I digress, because I'm not actually showing you this to talk about the history of medicine or the predilection of pre-teenage boys then or in more recent years to be interested in women's anatomy. Next slide, please. What I'm interested in is what people in the law enforcement business would call chain of custody. That book was published in 1846. And the copy in the museum's rare book collection was acquired by one M.A. Yale, who wrote their name on it on the flyleaf on March 19th, 1855. M.A. Yale was Maria Allen Yale. Yale was her married name. She married Dr. Leroy Yale, who oddly enough went to Harvard, and who came to the Vineyard, specifically to Holmes Hole, now Vineyard Haven, in the 1840s and set up shop as the town physician. He died of a tropical disease contracted while ministering to the sick crew members on board a schooner that had called at Holmes Hole Harbor. And after he died, Maria moved along with their young son, Leroy Yale Jr., back to her hometown of New York, where Leroy went to medical school, became a doctor in his own right, and became a noted pediatrician and writer on the diseases and proper care of children. Next slide. Leroy Yale Jr., in the fullness of time, grew to be an adult, and on December 21st, 1870, he took his copy of Mrs. Gove's book about the anatomy and physiology of women and presented to his colleague, Dr. Winthrop Butler, who had moved to Holmes Hole and taken over the job of being the town doctor in the 1870s and 80s. Dr. Butler kept his offices in a building roughly where Claudia's Jewelry is on Main Street now. He established his offices there, offices in the back, pharmacy in the front, rooms upstairs in the 1870s. And he provided one of his upstairs rooms to be the first home of the Ladies Library League, which established Vineyard Haven's first public library in the 1870s. When the Great Fire of 1883 leveled both sides of Main Street for 3 blocks, Dr. Butler rebuilt. And once again, he offered second floor rooms in his structure, the one that Claudia's is in now, as a home for what became in 1895 the Vineyard Haven Free Public Library. It stayed there until 1905, when it moved up the street to its present site, although not its present building. That was built in 1970. And Dr. Butler continued to serve the town as a physician, as Leroy Yale Sr. had done in his time, as Henry Beadle Huff's grandfather George did just after the Civil War. Winthrop Butler, in time, died, and his book passed to somebody else who, next slide, passed it on to us. I believe it was Dora Peaks, although I'd have to look. It was logged into the accessions of the Dukes County Historical Society as we were then in 1971. That number on the book plate inside the front cover, 71.58, meant at the time it was the 58th accession by the Historical Society in 1971. Nowadays, we'd write that 1971.058.001 for the first item in the 58th accession, etc. And there it's remained ever since, along with Daniel Fellows's copy of pharmacological recipes, along with George Huff's and Daniel Fisher's lecture notes from medical school, along with any number of other books kept by island physicians, including Winthrop Butler's obstetrical record books of babies delivered and all too often babies laid to rest in the decades that he served Holmes Hole as the town physician. I mentioned the book to point out that on its flyleaf and on its title page, we can trace its history over 150, now 170 years. We know, for this book at least, where it was from the moment that somebody, perhaps the elder Dr. Yale, placed it in Mrs. Yale's hands back in 1855. A remarkable thing and a reminder that the objects, even the mundane objects like this book, in the museum were all part of somebody's life or multiple somebody's lives once, that they all have people's stories connected to them, even if we don't know who those people were or what their stories were. Next slide. In this particular case, we know who one of the people was, and we know roughly what the story told in this letter was. Dear Walter, it begins. Walter being Walter A. Smith, the son of Amos Smith of Edgartown. Walter was born in 1880, and he was probably sometime in his mid to late teens when we think her name was Bertha, wrote him this 8-page, 2-sheet letter in a blue and hand delivered in a blue envelope prominently labeled personal. If you're suspecting that things are about to not go well for Walter, you would be right, because the upshot of it is, Walter, it's all over between us. I don't know why you thought you could talk to me that way, but Walter, no girl likes to be talked to that way. I still want to be your friend, but otherwise we're done. Go get stuffed. P.S. I hope you'll still continue coming around to visit my mother. Boys your age need to have a mother's influence in your life, and I hope you'll keep my mother in your life. Just don't tell her why we broke up. No, we don't know why they broke up either, although the explanation can be left as an exercise to the listener. This was one among hundreds of letters and thousands of documents in an enormous collection of papers of Amos Smith and his descendants that one of those descendants very kindly donated to the museum last month. The work of organizing and cataloging those papers is going to take up a good chunk of the rest of the spring and probably well into the summer. This was just one of the first things to float to the surface. And it is simultaneously a window on a wildly different world and a window on the extent to which some things, much as the world changes around them, are eternal, including human nature. The bottom of page 4 of this letter, Bertha, as we think her name was, says to Walter, when you're done reading this, please destroy it in some way, and you're on your honor to not mention it to anybody. Next slide, please. Walter, dutiful soul that he was, tore the first sheet of the letter up into 8 pieces. But he didn't tear up the second sheet, and he didn't throw away or burn or otherwise dispose of the bits of the first sheet. Next slide, please. It was left for somebody else, somebody probably not Walter, because that tape is too modern to be early 20th century cellophane tape. It's too shiny. It's also too sticky. If that had been early 20th century cellophane tape, the glue would have gone to hell and the cellophane would have fragmented long since. But somebody taped the bits back together, doubtless wondering what it was that Walter had done to Bertha that had caused her to angrily break it off in this letter written in such haste that by the middle of page 3, she was leaving out punctuation, capital letters, words, and paragraph breaks in her desire to get her feelings down on paper. The emotions that motivated teenage Walter and teenage Bertha to have whatever blow up ended their relationship would, I think, feel familiar to anybody who's ever been in their teens and had a blow up with their boyfriend or girlfriend, as is the dutiful tearing up of the letter, as is the irresistible desire to piece it back together. You'll notice that they pieced it back together with one of the pieces reversed, but we figured it out. As is the desire, then as now, to wonder what the deep, dark secret between these two long dead people might have been. Next slide. Once upon a time, there was a skating rink at the head of the steamer wharf in Oak Bluffs. The Santander Bank and the Lookout Tavern are there now. The skating rink lasted about 20 years from the late 1870s to the 15, from the late 1870s to the early 1890s, when it was destroyed in the same fire that burned the Seaview Hotel, where the staging area at the top of the wharf is now. But it wasn't just a skating rink. Next slide. It was part of an entire business venture undertaken by Frank Winslow, who also, next slide, manufactured a line of roller skates. Next slide. Including the Vineyard skate Model C, which, as you'll have figured out, implies the existence of a Vineyard skate Models A and B. And there was also the Vineyard clamp-on skate, 5 different models of Frank Winslow's Vineyard roller skate to choose from, all at very reasonable prices of $4.50 a pair. So Winslow ran the roller rink at Oak Bluffs. He sold roller skates, which you could doubtless acquire in the shop at the roller rink. And next slide. He staged exhibitions, not only of roller skating. Notice at the bottom there that there will be an exhibition of fancy skating on Saturday, the 28th of July, by the beautiful little skater, Miss Bessie Coles and Miss Carrie A. Gilmore, the finest lady skater in America. But before that, on the previous evening, Professor Canary, I can only assume that was a stage name, will give an exhibition of fancy bicycle riding. Riding on one wheel, devoid of all attachments, backward, an act never before attempted in the rink. Also a spin on the motorcycle, and his famous original upside down mount. It's moments like this when you realize that the past, in many ways, even if teenage relationship drama is eternal, that the past, the 1890s, the 1880s, really was a foreign country. I mean, Professor Canary's exhibitions of fancy bicycle riding. You say that to somebody now in the 2020s, and it sounds like a string of random words plucked from a hat in some kind of cosmic game of Mad Libs. And yet, in the social context of the 1880s, Professor so and so, Dr. so and so gave the performer an air of gravitas, an air of expertise, and fancy bicycle riding. Remember, bicycles had just begun to make the technological transition away from the penny farthing model with the gigantic 6-foot high front wheel and the tiny little rear wheel to what we now think of as an ordinary bicycle with two equal sized wheels and a chain drive connecting the pedals to the rear wheel. The shift to safety bicycles, as they were called in those days, and to pneumatic tires and to chain drives and things like that, made it possible for quote unquote fancy bicycle riding to be a thing. Just as the advent of cheap steel ball bearings made it possible for mass produced $5 roller skates and enormous roller skating rinks where you and your friends or you and your male or female admirer could go have a wholesome evening's entertainment by the shores of Vineyard Sound became a thing. Next slide. Costumed roller skating, plus an double exhibition of scientific and acrobatic skating. This is a window on a different world, a world that where scientific and where titles like doctor and professor carried weight unlike what they carry today, or were used to carry that weight in different places than they are today, where hype and promotion and ballyhoo was every bit as much a thing as it is on the internet today, and yet was carried out almost entirely, as in this flyer, through text rather than images or sound. As for bicycle polo on August 11th, I'll leave you to figure out how the heck that would have worked. Mind boggles. Next slide, please. This has no larger point behind it except to say, if this looks vaguely familiar, it's part of the old Marine Hospital that doesn't exist anymore. When they built the brick wing in what behind the old 1895 building in 1938, extending into what's now the Bodman Courtyard, the far end of the second floor was the operating theater, which had a tiled floor and tiled walls 3/4 of the way up and a gigantic high intensity electrical light fixture in the center of the ceiling. When Dorothy and Raoul St. Pierre bought the building to use as a sports camp in 1959, they took over the second floor of the brick wing as their living quarters. And this, the operating room, became their bedroom. That ceiling fan you can see in the upper left is where the doctor's operating light used to hang. They disconnected it and used the wiring to install the ceiling fan. But other than that, they left the operating room as an operating room. Tiled floor, tiled walls, steel doors and all. And through that doorway into the pink hallway, you're looking back down the axis of the old 1938 wing with the 1895 building beyond in the far distance. The 1938 brick wing is gone now. The fixtures from the operating room were sold off long ago, but we still have the pictures. And if you've ever wondered what it would have been like to have your bedroom in a former Marine Hospital operating room, well, now you know. Next slide. Coming later this spring, we're going to be putting up an exhibit called Selling Martha's Vineyard, about all the ways over the course of the post-Civil War era down to the present day, the vineyard's been marketed to a wider world. But it's not just the island that was being marketed in the era of mass tourism on the vineyard. It was also individual businesses like the Metropolitan Hotel, one of a dozen resort hotels that once dotted the town of Oak Bluffs. To orient you, you're standing in Circuit Avenue. If you stuck out your right hand, it would be pointed down Circuit Avenue past Linda Jean's towards DeRosa's. The street running off to the left is now the pedestrian mall outside the Oak Bluffs parking lot. Where it says Norton's Pharmacy there, that's where the corner store is today. The building isn't there anymore. The Metropolitan Hotel burned in 1945, an era when virtually all the big resort hotels in Oak Bluffs were either being reconfigured, like the Pawnee House, whose stump is now Ben and Bill's in Eastaway, or demolished entirely, like the Beatrice House. The Metropolitan Hotel, you'll notice, advertised itself as the best Oak Bluffs hotel of moderate prices. And you can rest assured that moderate prices in the early 20th century were a lot more moderate than moderate prices are today. Comfort without extravagance. So basically, they're going for the Hampton Inn market of the 1920s. Note that the old pre-World War II resort model with an on-site large dining room is still very much in play here. But note also that they have a telephone connection, but still, and that they're reaching market-wise for a market somewhere between the little dozen room inns and the really humongous resort hotels like the Wesley House or the Pawnee. Comfort without extravagance, not so large that the identity of a patron is lost. Marketing the vineyard was not just about marketing the island as a whole, as the Isle of Health or the Isle of pleasant breezes and fresh food. It was also about marketing your individual business and finding a niche for it within the vast cosmos of, by the 1920s, tourist businesses catering to those who are coming to the island. Next slide. Lest you think that political figures getting photoshopped into incongruous places was something that began with Bernie Sanders and his mittens, let me assure you that in 1992, we have it on good authority that President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev held a summit on Kennebec Avenue outside the Nashua House across from what's now Offshore Ale. And we, here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum, have the photographic evidence to prove it. What they thought of the rooms in this place in the history of hospitality went unrecorded by history. Next slide. Oh boy, a composition book. But a composition book in which Abigail Butler, who ran an inn in Edgartown for decades, kept her guest register. Next slide. Back up one, thank you. Starting in 1942, when Mrs. Somebody or other from 165 East 60th Street in New York City signed the register, Abigail Butler, year after year, kept this old battered composition book as a record of those who had stayed in her guest house. 30 years worth of names from Boston, from East Providence, from the Oranges, from Fifth Avenue, although note that the three women from Fifth Avenue are all listed as Miss, presumably well-to-do young women on a vacation, just us girls, before they settle down and become respectable married ladies somewhere in Manhattan. Next slide. But it wasn't just the names of guests that Abigail Butler kept here. She taped every year the lodging house license she was issued by the Commonwealth into the facing page of the book. And as the years roll by, she started to add other bits and pieces of useful information, like, next slide, please. In 1946, the schedule and fares for the first direct passenger service from Martha's Vineyard to Boston, New England Central Airways, flying into what had recently been the Martha's Vineyard Naval Auxiliary Airfield and out of what was not yet renamed General Edward E. Logan International Airport. Notice that it just says Edgartown and East Boston. Next slide, please. In 1947, you've got New England Central Airways has got a spiffy new brochure advertising service not only to the Vineyard, but Nantucket, New Bedford. But as you can see from the clipping pasted over the top of it, summer trains on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford are still very much a thing. Next slide, please. The Massachusetts steamship lines, which bought the remnants of the New England steamship lines from the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad at the end of 1945, is sputtering its way along, running the steamers Nantucket, later renamed Nobska, and Martha's Vineyard to and from the islands, along with an ugly new steam double-ender called the Islander, although in her previous service on the East River in New York, she'd been called the Hackensack. Notice at the bottom, fishermen, hundreds of prizes, plenty of game fish, striped bass derbies, Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket, May 31st through October 31st. The May 31st through the summer one would be Nantucket. The striped bass and bluefish derby on the Vineyard, mid-September to late October, was then 1947 in its second year of existence. Next slide. Fast forward to 1961, the Massachusetts steamship lines had long since gone bankrupt, and in order to ensure service to the island, the state stepped in and constituted what we now know of as the Steamship Authority, which after a strike in 1960 was reconstituted and operates to this day. This schedule, again pasted into Abigail Butler's guest register, captures the Steamship Authority in a moment of transition. Notice the top horizontal line of the timetable, steamer and ferry service, and notice that the trips are specifically designated as either ferry or steamer. The steamers in those days would have been the old Nantucket, now soldiering on under the name Nobska, and the new Nantucket, the last steam-powered ferry built for the island run in 1957, a gigantic hulking thing with a raked funnel cap and red naugahyde seats in its lunchroom, and a gigantic roll-up stern door that led unkind people to compare it to a garbage truck. The ferry was the then still relatively new Islander, not the little Hackensack of 1947, but the Islander that came on the line in 1950, the first truly modern diesel double-ender in the island service that ran for 57 years and then was replaced by the Island Home. The distinction between ferries, that is to say diesel-powered double-enders, basically a moving bridge that you drove onto one end of and off the other end at the other side, of the sound, and steamers, old-fashioned, not only steamships, but ships that looked like ships rather than like, well, bridges with a superstructure, seemed important then. But long before the Nashan was retired in 87, they'd all just become referred to as ferries. It's also worth noting that you could still check baggage on the ferries in those days, and you could still reserve a stateroom. Something that, if you were making the long run from New Bedford to Nantucket, something that still existed when the Nantucket, later Nashan, was built, could be a very handy thing indeed. Next slide. Registration certificate occupancy, room occupancy excise tax. Some long forgotten bit of bureaucraties that innkeepers needed to deal with, but that's not why I included it. It's 1966, and this is an IBM Punch Card, the standard way of entering data into mainframe computers long before mice and windows and graphical user interfaces, long even before screens that read out the results as the data as you inputted them on keyboards. We've come at this point a long way from 1942, and this register would run another 6 years in the same battered composition book. We've come a long way from the Massachusetts steamship lines, from the New Bedford, New York, and Hartford, New Haven, New York, and Hartford Railroad, and from the inauguration of air service between the Vineyard and Boston. By 1966, it was called the Martha's Vineyard Airport. By 1966, it was called Logan International. And the big jets, the 707s and DC-8s, were screaming into and out of the runways in East Boston. The Vineyard changed less quickly than Boston did, less quickly than New England did, less quickly than the world did between 1942 and 1966, but it changed profoundly. And Abigail Butler's battered little composition book, sat on the desk of the Butler Inn for 30 straight summers, chronicled in those cellophane taped bits of ephemera that she added to each year's page, the transformation of the Vineyard and of transportation to it and of the wider world beyond, which makes it a metaphor for the way history is written, not on clay tablets or stone tablets handed down to historians on top of a mountain somewhere, but one Dear Walter letter, one Reagan and Gorbachev Nashua Inn hotel flyer, one invitation to a scientific skating demonstration, one signed book, one odd little gay head postcard at a time. Thank you all, and if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to take
them. Thank you so much, Bo. I know I've been thinking about Walter and Bertha since you told that story, and I will probably be thinking about them for a long time. It really makes you reflect on the letters you wrote as a kid or received, and whether or not they would end up in a museum one day. It really makes you ponder that. So we did have just a couple of questions. The first one is from John, who wanted to know about our budding cinematographer, Charles James. Do you know what he ended up doing with his life?
Boy, I wish I did. And when I was cataloging the James collection, I chased after his name down every rabbit hole I could find. And all I've been able to tell is he was married in 1943 to a woman whose name we don't know. And he went into the Naval Reserves and served at Newport, Rhode Island, which could mean a lot of things. Um, and I cannot find any trace of him. I The family business in Philadelphia, which was a fancy food store that had been run by his father's family back into the late 19th century, shut down around the end of World War II. So he didn't go into the family business. But I can't find hide nor hair of him. I don't know whether he didn't survive the war or whether he changed his name or whether he moved to Montana and herded sheep and made strange experimental films about all things ovine that didn't leave a paper trail. But now he is thus far a mystery. Anybody out there knows anything about Charles Mason James? I would love to know.
Well, John, maybe that's a task for you if you're still with us. Maybe you could do a little background work on figuring out whatever happened to Charles. So we have another question from Timothy, who wanted to know about the Beatrice house in Oak Bluffs. Do you happen to know when and why it was demolished?
I do not specifically. I would guess that the answer is the answer to why the top two floors of the island house were taken off and why the top three floors of the Pawnee were taken off and why a number of other Oak Bluffs hotels didn't survive the post World War II era, which was that the shift from long stay weeks, months, even the entire season at a time tourism where people would hang out at a given hotel, as indeed the Jameses did at the Harborview in Edgartown, for extended periods to post World War II, come for shorter periods. And if you're going to come for a long time, maybe rent a house style tourism caused a massive market contraction in the hotel industry. And it just wasn't viable for many of the hotels that had been operating before the war and even before 1900 um, to continue to be so. If you've got a tiny little bed and breakfasty style inn, you can always turn it back into a house. If you've got a ginormous space like the Pawnee, you can always whack the top three floors off of it and turn the bottom into retail. But those mid-range hotels like the Beatrice house, I suspect, fell between the proverbial two stools. They were too big to be a private home, too small, or perhaps too far off the main drag. Although in the case of the Beatrice house, it was just the far side of the of Circuit Ave, perhaps too far off the beaten path or wrongly laid out to be commercially viable. And so it was torn down and sold for the land. But that's conjecture on my part. And it may be that Skip Finley or Hal Garneau or one of those people who knows, who's forgotten more about the history of Oak Bluffs than I will ever know, have some more detailed information. Which, if they do, they will doubtless email me tomorrow and say, well, you know, the real story is, and I will try to pass that on to the wider world.
So there were a few more questions that came in, but we are beyond our time for the program. So for those of you who had some questions, I'm going to pass them along to Bo after the program, and we do have your contact information so we could get those answers to you. I apologize for that, but we want to thank all of you for joining us for this program. And just to let you know, next month's Hidden Collections will be the last. Poor Bo is going to get a little bit of a breather. So you will not want to miss the last of our Hidden Collection series before we put a pause on that for the summer. So please join us the first Wednesday in May at 12:30, again, to hear more of these fascinating stories. So thank you for joining us, and thank you so much to Bo.
Thanks, everybody. See you in May.